From the outside, Haiti is often spoken about in fragments. News flashes, short clips, sudden images of smoke, crowds running, or armed men roaming through narrow streets. But behind those scattered images lies a long, painful story that stretches back decades. A story of a nation that has fought not only natural disasters and economic hardship, but also internal wars, powerful gangs, political instability, and the daily struggle of ordinary people simply trying to survive. This video takes you deep into that story. Not just the headlines, not just the recent chaos, but the journey that led Haiti to where it is today. A journey full of hope, betrayal, resilience, and endless battles. Some fought with guns, others fought in silence. And to truly understand what is happening in Haiti today, we must go back to the roots of the conflict, long before the current violence escalated, long before the world turned its cameras toward Port-au-Prince. This is the story of Haiti's wars, how they began, how they evolved, and how they continue to shape the life of a nation still fighting for peace. The story begins many years before the current chaos, in the streets and mountains of a country that has endured more turbulence than most. Haiti has always been a land of contradictions. Incredible pride mixed with deep wounds, fierce independence standing side by side with painful political divisions. Even after becoming the world's first black republic in 1804, a victory that shook the foundations of colonial rule, Haiti never truly tasted the peace it fought so hard for. From its earliest days, powerful families, rival political groups, and outside influences competed for control, leaving the young nation in a constant struggle for stability. As decades passed, these political tensions never fully dissolved. They grew, changed shape, and resurfaced whenever leadership faltered. By the late 20th century, Haiti had already lived through dictatorships, uprisings, coups, and long periods of military rule. Each wave of conflict left scars on the population, and every attempt at rebuilding seemed to be crushed by corruption, broken institutions, and deepening poverty. By the time democracy began to take root again in the 1990s, the seeds of future conflict were already planted. Communities in the poorest neighborhoods, especially in Port-au-Prince, had long survived without reliable government services. No security, limited healthcare, and few jobs. Into this vacuum stepped armed groups who offered what the state couldn't: protection, money, or at least the promise of control. At first these groups were small, often tied to political actors who used them during election periods. But as Haiti's governments changed rapidly, one after another, these armed groups started growing more independent, more powerful, and more deeply rooted in their territories. The people, stuck between survival and fear, often had no choice but to coexist with them. Then came the devastating earthquake in 2010. It didn't just destroy buildings. It shattered institutions, broke down the little stability that remained, and opened the door for gangs to rise even further. Thousands of prisoners escaped when the main prison collapsed, many of them joining or forming armed groups. Humanitarian aid poured into the country, but corruption and mismanagement weakened its impact. The government struggled to recover, and as it did, the armed groups continued expanding their influence, gaining weapons, money, and control over entire districts. By the mid-2010s, Haiti's fragile political environment was already showing cracks. Elections were disputed, governments were accused of corruption, and protests filled the streets. As the state weakened, the gangs strengthened. They formed alliances, broke them, and formed new ones. Unofficial borders appeared inside the capital, neighborhoods ruled not by police, but by armed men who controlled roads, markets, and even who could enter or leave certain areas. People could feel the pressure rising, like the quiet air before a storm. Daily life became unpredictable. A simple journey to buy food or visit family could be dangerous, because crossing from one gang-controlled area to another meant risking your life. Many families stayed indoors as much as possible. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Schools opened and closed irregularly. Every day felt like living in a country waiting for something to explode. By the time President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated in 2021, the situation had already reached a boiling point. His death didn't create the chaos. It unlocked it. Power struggles intensified, political leadership fractured, and the gangs sensed an opportunity. They moved quickly, spreading into areas they had never controlled before. In a matter of months, Port-au-Prince was transformed into a patchwork of territories, each ruled by different groups, each demanding loyalty or fear. The roots of today's war had fully taken shape. What had once been scattered political groups had evolved into networks of heavily armed factions. What had once been simple neighborhood disputes had grown into organized, brutal conflict. And the people, the innocent families caught in the middle, found themselves trapped in a daily fight for survival. This is where Haiti's modern war truly begins. Not with one moment, one leader, or one attack, but with a long, painful buildup that stretched across decades. A storm gathering slowly, quietly, until the sky finally broke open. As the years rolled on after President Moïse's assassination, Haiti moved into a new and dangerous chapter. One where the thin line between state authority and gang power began to disappear almost completely. What had once been separate criminal groups, each controlling their own corners of the capital, started to transform into something far more organized. The collapse of political leadership had created a vacuum, and the men who filled it weren't politicians, weren't police commanders, and weren't community leaders. They were gang figures who had learned to rule their territories the way a general rules a battlefield. The people of Haiti could feel the shift long before the world understood what was happening. Roadblocks began appearing in places that had always been safe. School children walked nervously in groups, knowing that crossing into the wrong neighborhood could spark trouble. Families whispered about gunshots at night, sometimes too close to their homes, sometimes in the same alley where they had once bought fruits or walked to church. The city that had once been full of noise, markets shouting, motorcycles buzzing, children playing, slowly turned into a place where silence felt heavier than sound. As the government weakened further, gangs recognized that strength came from unity. Slowly, alliances formed. Some were based on old friendships, some on shared enemies, and others on pure strategy. Two major coalitions emerged, each made up of several powerful gangs. These groups controlled roads, ports, fuel depots, and entire neighborhoods. They decided who moved, who stayed, who traded, and who suffered. The capital became a maze of invisible borders that only they understood. In many communities, police presence became almost symbolic. Stations were understaffed, officers lacked equipment, and some were too afraid or too outnumbered to confront heavily armed groups. Others simply abandoned their posts. The few who continued doing their jobs became targets, constantly moving to avoid ambushes. For ordinary Haitians, the idea of calling the police for help became almost unrealistic, because everyone knew the gangs often arrived faster, louder, and stronger. At the same time, prisons across the country became overcrowded and unstable. Riots broke out, escapes increased, and arms smuggling grew worse. Every escape strengthened one faction or another, adding new fighters who were desperate, experienced, and ready for confrontation. In the slums and crowded urban districts, the sound of gunfire became part of the weekly rhythm. Some days it was far away, other days it echoed right outside someone's window. Businesses shut down as transport became too dangerous. Truck drivers refused to take certain routes unless they paid large sums to pass through gang-controlled checkpoints. Hospitals ran out of supplies. Food became more expensive, and those who could barely survive now found themselves skipping entire meals. The fear of kidnapping dominated daily life. No one felt safe. Students, vendors, pastors, even foreigners. Everyone was a potential target. Meanwhile, political leaders argued about power, elections, and who had the right to govern, while ordinary Haitians faced a brutal reality on the streets. Many felt abandoned, as if the world had forgotten them, as if their nation had been left to navigate the storms alone. Those who had once believed in change now simply hoped to make it through each day. Parents kept their children indoors not because they wanted to, but because stepping outside sometimes meant gambling with death. In some places, local communities tried to resist. Men with makeshift weapons gathered at night to guard their neighborhoods. They were not soldiers, and many had no training, but desperation forced them to act. Stories spread of entire streets forming human chains to stop hostile groups from entering. Others built barricades of old tires, metal scraps, and wooden planks, hoping these small defenses would keep danger away for a few hours longer. Yet despite their courage, these community defenses were often crushed quickly by groups armed with rifles, grenade launchers, and vehicles. As gang coalitions grew more powerful, they also became more organized. They held meetings, planned strategies, divided responsibilities, and coordinated attacks the way militias would in a war zone. Territories changed hands after fierce battles that left neighborhoods burned and families displaced. Some groups began collecting taxes from residents, forcing them to pay protection fees just to stay in their own homes. Others controlled markets, demanding payment from traders and even setting prices on essential goods. Fuel shortages became a weapon. One coalition seized control of a major oil terminal, choking the country's fuel supply. Without gasoline, transport collapsed, hospitals shut down, supermarkets struggled to keep their generators running, and people waited in endless lines in the heat, hoping to get a few liters of fuel. It became clear that the gangs were no longer fighting small battles. They were holding the entire country hostage. International organizations tried to step in with food, medicine, and aid, but delivering help became increasingly dangerous. Trucks were hijacked, containers looted, and humanitarian workers threatened. Even the United Nations warned that Haiti was sliding into something beyond a political crisis, something closer to an internal war. Amid this chaos, a new wave of displacement began. Thousands fled their homes, carrying their belongings in plastic bags or pushing them in wheelbarrows as they moved from neighborhood to neighborhood, searching for safety. Schools were turned into temporary shelters filled with mothers, infants, and elderly people sleeping on thin mats. The lucky ones found relatives to take them in. The unlucky ones slept under makeshift tents near busy roads or in church compounds. And yet, through all this turmoil, the spirit of the people remained astonishing. Even in the darkest moments, Haitians gathered in small groups to pray, to share the little they had, or to comfort one another. They were tired, frightened, and angry, but still hopeful that one day the violence would end. By now, Haiti was no longer simply dealing with crime. It was dealing with a full-scale breakdown of order. A situation where the government struggled to function, communities defended themselves, and armed coalitions fought for dominance. The country stood at the edge of something even more dangerous, something that would soon erupt into open warfare between gang alliances, civilians, and any authority still standing. This was the new reality. A nation where the old rules had faded, where survival depended on luck, local alliances, and the shifting decisions of armed men. And in the shadows of this growing conflict, a much larger battle was preparing to explode. As the months passed, Haiti reached a point where the tension could no longer sit quietly in the air. All the broken institutions, the political arguments, the growing gang alliances, the kidnappings, the shortages, the fear. It all pushed the country toward a moment where the conflict could no longer stay hidden inside neighborhoods. It began to spill onto the streets in broad daylight, as if the whole country was being dragged into a fight it never asked for. What truly changed the atmosphere was how boldly the armed groups began to move. They no longer operated only at night or in isolated corners of the capital. They now appeared in the open, moving through major roads in large numbers, armed to the teeth, some riding motorcycles, others walking in formation like soldiers taking over territory. People who had lived in Port-au-Prince their entire lives said they had never seen anything like it. Young men no older than 20 carrying rifles longer than their arms, shouting orders, blocking intersections, and treating every road as if it was part of their kingdom. The government tried to respond. Police units were deployed, but many officers were outnumbered and outgunned. Some police stations were overwhelmed within hours, their officers forced to retreat or take shelter wherever they could. In certain districts, police fled entirely, leaving behind empty buildings that were quickly looted or burned. Residents watched helplessly as their last line of protection crumbled in front of their eyes. What made things worse was that the political leadership at the top was divided, uncertain, and constantly pressured by international partners. Every decision seemed slow, every action seemed too late, and as the leadership struggled to find direction, the gangs tightened their grip even more. They understood power. They understood timing. and they knew that the country was drifting without a clear captain steering the ship. The battles grew fiercer. Gunfire echoed across the city at unpredictable times, sometimes early in the morning when students were preparing for school, other times in the middle of the afternoon when vendors filled the markets. People learned to drop to the ground whenever shots rang out. Children became experts in telling the difference between pistols, rifles, and automatic bursts just by the sounds they made. It was a harsh education delivered by the streets. Families began organizing their lives around danger. Before leaving home, they checked community WhatsApp groups to see which roads were safe, which areas were blocked, and where fighting had been reported. Mothers walked faster, always holding their children's hands tightly. Workers left their jobs earlier than usual because being outside after sunset became a risk no one wanted to take. And yet, despite all the caution, danger seemed to move unpredictably, like smoke that could appear anywhere at any moment. Inside the gang-controlled territories, life became even more extreme. Some groups imposed curfews. Others allowed no one in or out without permission. Markets closed, schools shut down, and small businesses that had survived years of hardship finally collapsed. Power outages became longer, food supplies thinner, and clean water harder to access. The city's infrastructure, already fragile, began to fall apart under the weight of the conflict. Soon, the violence wasn't just territorial, it became symbolic. Armed groups targeted government institutions, police headquarters, courts, and warehouses. Their message was clear. They were no longer just criminal outfits, they were power brokers. They wanted influence, control, negotiation, and recognition. They wanted to shape Haiti's future according to their own terms. And as the gangs made their ambitions clear, the civilian population paid the price. Entire families fled their homes in the middle of the night when fighting erupted at their doorsteps. Thousands gathered around public buildings, sleeping on bare floors, waiting for help that often came too slowly. Children cried because they didn't understand why they were suddenly living in a school classroom with strangers. Elderly people collapsed from heat, stress, and exhaustion. The humanitarian situation worsened with every passing week. But in the midst of all this suffering, something else began to rise. Anger. The people were tired of running, tired of watching their communities burn, tired of waiting for leaders who never arrived. The pressure inside the country reached a breaking point, and a new movement began forming quietly among ordinary Haitians. They met in backyards, in church courtyards, and in small alleyways, whispering about taking back their neighborhoods. Some carried sticks, others machetes, some just stones. They had no formal training, no heavy weapons, just the desire to protect their families. This movement would soon grow into something that would shake the country and shock the world. But at this moment in the story, it was still a spark, a quiet, burning anger waiting for the right moment to explode. And as all sides, the gangs, the civilians, the police, and the struggling government, prepared for their next moves, Haiti stood on the edge of something even more volatile. The city was no longer just a place of fear. It was becoming a battlefield, a place where alliances shifted every week, where new fronts opened unexpectedly, and where survival depended not just on luck, but on understanding the rhythm of a war that had no clear rules. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. And the next chapter of this conflict would test the strength, courage, and desperation of every person living through it. As the streets of Port-au-Prince turned into unpredictable war zones, something began to shift in the hearts of the people. The fear that had kept them silent for years slowly transformed into a collective anger. An anger built from sleepless nights, lost family members, empty plates, burned homes, and the constant humiliation of living under the control of armed men. Haiti had seen rebellions before, in fact, its very existence was born out of one. But this time, the rebellion didn't come from organized soldiers or political revolutionaries. It began with ordinary citizens, men and women who had reached their limit. In every neighborhood, stories spread of families who had been driven out, of mothers who had lost their children, of fathers who had disappeared after refusing to pay extortion money. These stories traveled from house to house, from alley to alley, until entire communities realized they were all experiencing the same nightmare. And slowly, quietly, a new force began to emerge, one not led by a single person, but by a shared desire to reclaim their dignity. At first, the resistance was small and spontaneous. In one neighborhood, men stood at the entrance of their street with sticks and rocks, refusing to let gunmen pass. In another, women banged on pots and pans at night to warn their neighbors that armed groups were approaching. Young people formed watch groups, rotating shifts to monitor movement in nearby streets. It was risky, it was dangerous, and in many cases it was all they had. Then, something unexpected happened. These small acts of resistance began to connect. Neighborhoods that had once been isolated from each other by fear now started sharing information, strategies, and courage. Communication spread through whispers, through WhatsApp groups, through late-night meetings lit by candles or tiny kerosene lamps. And soon, what started as isolated acts of survival grew into a national movement, one that the world would come to know as a civilian uprising against gang dominance. People armed themselves with whatever they could find. Some carried machetes, the same tools they used for farming or cooking. Others wielded metal pipes, old hammers, broken chair legs, or sharpened pieces of scrap iron. They had no rifles, no bulletproof vests, no powerful allies, only the determination to protect their families. And in a country where the authorities struggled to maintain control, this civilian force began filling the vacuum. The movement wasn't just about fighting. It became a way of reclaiming hope. Community members who had once felt powerless now found strength in one another. Elderly men and women who remembered earlier political struggles offered guidance. Young men who had grown up surrounded by violence vowed not to let their neighborhoods fall any deeper into chaos. There were arguments, disagreements, and moments of deep fear, but the people had made a choice. They would not sit quietly anymore. The first major confrontation between civilians and armed groups shocked the entire country. It happened early one morning when a gang attempted to expand into a densely populated residential area. Instead of running, residents barricaded the streets with old refrigerators, abandoned vehicles, and piles of rubble. When the armed men tried to enter, they were met with a wave of resistance that caught them off guard. Hundreds of people poured out of their homes, not with guns, but with the raw determination of a community refusing to surrender. Videos of these confrontations began circulating online. People from other neighborhoods watched in disbelief as civilians pushed back, shouting, running, and standing their ground. What once seemed impossible now felt achievable. Every new act of resistance inspired another. Communities across the city began organizing more boldly, more openly, and with more confidence. But this resistance came at a heavy cost. Armed groups responded violently, launching retaliatory attacks that left families devastated. Entire blocks were burned, houses destroyed, and some organizers were targeted. Civilians hid their faces when joining neighborhood patrols, afraid of being recognized. Mothers cried constantly, praying that their sons and husbands would return alive each night. The courage of the movement was powerful, but the risks were enormous. Despite the danger, the spirit of resistance kept growing. People set up makeshift checkpoints using old tires and wooden planks. They developed their own warning systems using whistles or banging metal objects to alert neighbors. Young people patrolled rooftops to observe movement from above. Carpenters built wooden shields, mechanics created improvised barriers, and older men shared whatever knowledge they had of defending territory. For the first time in years, the gangs began to feel pressure. Not just from the police, not from foreign governments, but from the very people they had tried to dominate. And that realization changed the conflict completely. The gangs responded with more aggression, trying to reassert control. The civilians countered with more determination, refusing to go back to living under fear. The battle for Haiti was no longer just between armed groups and the state. It had become a struggle between those who sought to control the country and those who simply wanted to survive. And although the civilians were outgunned, their unity made them unpredictable, powerful, and impossible to ignore. By this time, international attention had returned to Haiti. Reports described a country on the edge of collapse, a capital city where civilians patrolled their own streets, and neighborhoods where people acted as both police and protector. Foreign governments debated whether to intervene, while Haitians continued fighting for their lives day after day. This rising civilian movement would soon collide with larger military actions, government responses, and major gang offensives. And as the tension escalated, Haiti moved closer to the most intense period of violence it had seen in years, a period that would reshape the future of the country and determine whether hope or fear would dominate the years to come. As the civilian resistance grew stronger and the gangs became more aggressive, Haiti entered a phase that felt unlike anything the country had experienced before. It wasn't just the fighting, the fear, or the shifting alliances. It was the sense that the entire nation was holding its breath, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. The streets were filled with uncertainty. Every sound carried meaning. Every night felt like a test. And everywhere, the people whispered that Haiti had reached a breaking point. The world had been watching from a distance, but now the situation could no longer be ignored. International news agencies began broadcasting haunting images. Families running with their belongings, black smoke rising from burning homes, and long lines of displaced people walking with no destination except somewhere safe. For many viewers, Haiti's crisis seemed sudden, but for Haitians, it was a disaster years in the making. What made this period especially intense was the scale of displacement. Entire communities began emptying out. Streets that were once full of life, children playing soccer, women selling fruit, men fixing motorcycles on the roadside, became silent. Doors that had been open for decades were locked permanently. People who had built their lives in one neighborhood for generations suddenly became refugees in their own country. Shelters overflowed. Schools and churches that hosted displaced families ran out of space, food, and water. Mothers tried to comfort their children with songs even when they themselves had nothing left to give. Pregnant women slept on cold floors. Babies shared small bowls of food. People searched tirelessly for missing relatives. And through all this, gunfire continued to echo in the distance like a cruel reminder that the nightmare was far from over. Meanwhile, the armed coalitions took advantage of this chaos. They launched coordinated offensives, targeting police stations, government ministries, broadcasting centers, and key infrastructure. Their goal was clear: to show that they, not the state, controlled the country. These attacks were not random. They were strategic, calculated, and designed to break whatever remained of Haiti's official authority. For the government and the international community, this was the moment when the alarm bells became too loud to ignore. Reports described Haiti as being on the verge of total collapse. Diplomats, security analysts, and humanitarian agencies warned that if decisive action wasn't taken soon, the situation would become irreversible. But while officials held emergency meetings in distant capitals, Haitians continued to live the reality of the crisis hour by hour. The police, though exhausted and heavily outnumbered, attempted to push back. Some units fought bravely, making last stands at stations that were gradually surrounded. Officers who had once patrolled confidently now found themselves defending buildings with limited ammunition and little backup. Some slept in their uniforms, too afraid to go home. Others stood on rooftops at night, scanning the darkness for movement. The battles spread across major routes. Roads connecting different parts of the city became contested zones. Bridges were destroyed or taken over. Cars lined up for miles as people desperately tried to flee. And those who couldn't leave found themselves trapped, praying that the clashes would pass quickly. The civilian resistance continued its efforts, but the pressure became overwhelming. In some neighborhoods, civilians fought tirelessly for hours, only to retreat when the firepower became too great. They carried injured neighbors through alleyways, hid families inside fortified rooms, and moved children from one shelter to another in hopes of avoiding the violence. But for every small victory the civilians achieved, the gangs responded with twice the force. As chaos deepened, fear began to turn into frustration. Many Haitians felt abandoned by their leaders, by foreign governments, and even by the world. They wondered how many more lives would be lost before real help arrived. They asked themselves how long they could continue fighting without proper weapons, without resources, and without a functioning government to support them. Food shortages worsened. Water became harder to find. Hospitals ran on fumes. Doctors performed surgeries without electricity. People lined up outside clinics, not knowing whether the doors would open or whether the building would be attacked. Everything, from medicine to baby formula to basic hygiene supplies, became scarce. The crisis was no longer just about violence. It was about survival in every form. At the same time, fear spread beyond Port-au-Prince. Towns near the capital felt the shockwaves of the conflict. Some people attempted to flee to the countryside, hoping it would be safer. Others tried to leave the country entirely, boarding dangerous boats or seeking help from embassies that were overwhelmed with desperate appeals. Then came the moment that finally forced the world to wake up. Coordinated attacks targeted multiple key state institutions at once. Government offices were overtaken, airports were threatened, and major highways were cut off. The gangs had made their message crystal clear. They were ready to challenge the entire system. International broadcasts called it an emergency, a national collapse, and a humanitarian disaster. World leaders held urgent meetings. Aid agencies warned that millions were at risk. For a brief moment, Haiti became the center of global attention. Not because of its culture, its strength, or its history, but because it stood at the edge of complete devastation. But even in this dark moment, the people of Haiti did not give up. They continued to fight back in any way they could. They helped strangers, shared food, protected children, and held on to the hope that someday the violence would end. Because for them, hope wasn't a luxury, it was a weapon. It was the only thing stronger than fear. And as the world debated what to do next, Haiti prepared to enter the most complicated and dangerous phase of its struggle. One that would test not only the strength of its people, but the conscience of the entire international community. As Haiti's crisis intensified and the world finally turned its attention toward the island, a new chapter began. One filled with political negotiations, international debates, and questions that carried enormous consequences. The collapse inside Haiti was no longer just a national issue. It had become a global concern. Every government, every international organization, and every regional power understood that Haiti was standing on the edge of something catastrophic. But understanding the crisis and acting on it were two very different things. For years, the international community had debated whether to intervene. Some countries argued that without outside help, Haiti would fall deeper into violence. Others warned that intervention had failed in the past, leaving scars that were still felt by older generations. So even as the violence escalated, the world hesitated, unsure of how to act without repeating past mistakes. Inside conference rooms thousands of miles away from Port-au-Prince, diplomats studied maps covered in red zones, areas controlled by heavily armed coalitions. They examined satellite images showing roadblocks, burned homes, and displaced families camped near highways. Reports on human rights abuses piled up. Intelligence briefings described gangs transporting weapons openly, sometimes even using drones to watch over their territories. The situation was far beyond what any local institution could handle alone. But while these diplomatic discussions continued, Haiti's reality was growing harsher by the day. Every hour that passed without action meant more families fleeing their homes, more children going missing, more communities torn apart. Humanitarian agencies grew desperate. They sent urgent messages to world leaders saying that their workers couldn't reach people who needed help most. Some food convoys were forced to turn back after gunshots erupted nearby. Others were hijacked entirely. The streets became too unpredictable to navigate safely. And still, the world debated. Meanwhile, Haitian leaders, though divided, pressed for international assistance. They pleaded for peacekeepers, for specialized police units, for any form of support that could help stabilize the country. But they also faced fierce criticism from citizens who feared foreign intervention. Many Haitians remembered how past missions had brought new problems, new scandals, and new wounds. The distrust ran deep. This created a painful dilemma. Haiti desperately needed help, but many Haitians feared the very help they needed. In the midst of this hesitation, several countries stepped forward and announced they were willing to lead an international mission to help restore order. This mission would not be a traditional military occupation, but a specialized force designed to support local police, open humanitarian routes, and protect key infrastructure. Plans were drafted. Timelines were proposed. Agreements were signed. but implementation moved slowly. Too slowly. As the world tried to organize itself, the gangs inside Haiti took advantage of the delay. They expanded their territories, seized more government buildings, attacked police stations, and solidified control over transportation routes. Every day they grew bolder. Armed men walked openly through the streets with video cameras, live streaming their power as if they were documenting their own rise. It was psychological warfare, designed to show that no authority could stop them. Inside Haiti, people listened to the radio or checked their phones constantly, hoping for news that the international mission was finally arriving. Some whispered prayers. Others expressed anger. Most simply waited, unsure whether help would come in time, or whether it would come at all. At the same time, international humanitarian organizations issued warnings of an impending famine. Port-au-Prince's main port was partially shut down. Fuel storage facilities were inaccessible. Loose networks of volunteers risked their lives to bring food into neighborhoods under siege. It became clear that Haiti's crisis was no longer only about violence. It was turning into a humanitarian collapse on a national scale. The pressure mounted on the global stage. Countries that had initially hesitated now faced growing criticism from activists, human rights groups, and even their own citizens who asked, "How can the world watch a nation burn and do nothing?" Debates erupted in parliaments and congresses. Weekly updates on Haiti appeared in major newspapers. Foreign ministers traveled to emergency meetings. The world began to feel the weight of its inaction. Finally, after months of preparation, the first steps toward deployment became official. Countries contributed troops, police units, medical teams, and equipment. Training began. Flights were scheduled. Press conferences were held. Haiti's people listened to every announcement with cautious hope, but also deep skepticism. They had been promised help before, and those promises had sometimes brought more suffering than relief. But there was no denying the reality. The mission was coming. And when it arrived, it would enter a country where the battlefield stretched from the capital into the countryside, where tens of thousands of civilians were displaced, and where armed groups had turned entire districts into fortified zones. As Haiti awaited the arrival of this international force, the tension grew heavier than ever. Some people prepared to flee in case the fighting escalated. Others stocked up on supplies, fearing the worst. And many simply continued with their daily struggles, because survival left little room for planning. The gangs, fully aware of the impending arrival, began strategizing. They fortified their strongholds, reinforced checkpoints, and increased patrols. They broadcast messages declaring that no foreign force would stop their ambitions. Some promised to fight to the death. Others threatened retaliation against civilians if foreign troops intervened. This was the stage Haiti had arrived at. A nation trapped between hope and fear, between international promises and local realities, between the possibility of rescue and the danger of even greater conflict. The next chapter of Haiti's story would determine everything, whether the international mission would bring relief or ignite a new wave of violence, whether the civilian resistance would survive, and whether the country could finally step back from the brink. And as the world watched closely, Haiti braced itself for what was coming next. As the crisis deepened, Haiti entered a phase where survival itself became a daily negotiation, and the boundaries between ordinary life and the world of armed conflict blurred almost completely. Section 7 explores this period, when international intervention debates grew louder, when communities tried to defend themselves with whatever they had, and when the struggle for control between gangs, the government, and civil society turned the country into a patchwork of fragile pockets of hope and overwhelming despair. In the capital, Port-au-Prince, the nights became the most dangerous hours. People learned to recognize gunfire the way one might recognize rain, distinguishing the distance, the seriousness, the type of weapon. Entire neighborhoods were under the rule of gangs who operated like separate states, each with its own laws, its own checkpoints, and its own punishment systems. Families moved in silence after sunset, avoiding even the sound of a closing door, because noise could attract the wrong attention. For many, the greatest fear wasn't death itself, but the uncertainty of when or how violence would strike. Meanwhile, inside government offices, there were frantic attempts to negotiate with gang leaders in back-channel talks, hoping to carve out temporary truces. Some of these fragile agreements lasted only hours. Others held for days before collapsing violently. These short-lived moments of calm allowed humanitarian groups to move supplies into critical zones. Trucks carrying food, water, and medicine would rush through streets, escorted by local volunteers holding makeshift flags, signaling safe passage. Despite their bravery, many convoys still fell into ambushes, forcing aid agencies to reconsider whether their presence was even possible without external support. This growing sense of desperation pushed Haiti's allies abroad to debate whether an international security mission should intervene. Different countries issued statements, some expressing readiness to send specialized support, others insisting that Haiti needed a strategy rooted in long-term political stability rather than another foreign-led force. Haitian citizens themselves were divided. Some pleaded for outside help, exhausted from years of living between conflict lines. Others feared that foreign intervention might inflame tensions or repeat the mistakes of previous missions. The uncertainty made every discussion feel urgent yet fragile. Inside the country, civil society groups refused to give up. Pastors, teachers, nurses, and youth activists created networks of safe shelters in churches, schools, and abandoned buildings. These spaces gave families fleeing violence temporary relief. Children were given blankets and rice, and adults shared whispered stories of the homes they had escaped. Yet even within these sanctuaries, food was limited, fear was ever present, and the sound of nearby clashes reminded everyone that safety was temporary at best. Still, the determination of communities to protect one another became one of the few unbroken threads holding the country together. At the same time, Haiti's business community faced collapse. Ports were repeatedly blocked, warehouses burned, and banks struggled to operate. Prices soared beyond what ordinary people could afford. A kilo of rice could cost more than a week's wages, and fuel, when available, was sold on the black market at impossible prices. This collapse of daily economic life pushed more young people into the arms of gangs, not because they sought violence, but because it was one of the few ways to secure food, protection, or income. This deepened the cycle, giving the armed groups steady recruitment while hollowing out the workforce and destabilizing entire neighborhoods. International journalists who managed to enter the country reported scenes that shocked the world. Families building barricades with old furniture, women carrying water for miles under the shadow of armed lookouts, and children who had learned to dive to the ground at the first echo of gunfire. Yet these same reporters also captured moments of resilience. Musicians playing drums in the ruins of broken streets, market women rebuilding stalls after each attack, and neighbors who shared their last bit of food with families they barely knew. Haiti's story was not just one of conflict. It was a story of people fighting to remain human in the middle of chaos. By this stage, it was clear that Haiti's struggle was not a simple confrontation between guns and government. It was a battle for the soul of a nation, between fear and hope, between collapse and resilience, between those who destroyed and those who rebuilt. Every day brought new uncertainty, but also new demonstrations of courage, as Haitians continued to resist not only the violence around them, but the idea that their country was beyond saving. As Haiti edged deeper into what many described as a humanitarian catastrophe, Section 8 reveals a period when the crisis took on new layers, where political collapse, economic desperation, and escalating violence fused into a single national struggle. It was a time when the institutions that were supposed to offer stability had almost completely crumbled, leaving a vacuum that gangs, community groups, and international actors each tried to fill in their own way. This section captures the intensity of that moment. The desperation, the negotiations, the last attempts to hold together a country pulled apart by fear and exhaustion. Across Port-au-Prince and beyond, the sense of normal life vanished almost entirely. Government buildings that once housed ministries and administrative offices stood half-empty, with only skeleton teams trying to manage files, write reports, or maintain communication with the outside world. Electricity outages became the norm, and officials often worked by candlelight or using small battery-powered lamps. Yet even in these conditions, bureaucrats tried to produce plans for restoring order. Proposals for police reform, community safety programs, and emergency economic relief. But these plans rarely moved beyond paper. With armed groups controlling critical roads and ports, implementing any national strategy became nearly impossible. Outside these weakened institutions, gang federations tightened their grip on territory. In some areas, they began acting like de facto governments, organizing their own security patrols, setting informal taxes, and even mediating local disputes. For residents, dealing with these groups was not a matter of choice but survival. Parents instructed their children on how to behave if approached by gang members, teaching them to speak calmly, avoid sudden movements, and never make eye contact for too long. Schools that remained open held classes intermittently, stopping lessons whenever gunfire grew too close. Many children carried notebooks in one hand and identification letters in the other, in case they needed to flee at a moment's notice. Humanitarian organizations continued to push deeper into affected neighborhoods, but the risks grew significantly. Nurses and doctors working with medical NGOs traveled with armed escorts, sometimes provided by local community volunteers, sometimes negotiated through uneasy agreements with gang leaders. Makeshift clinics sprouted in churches, in backyards, even under trees. Medical workers treated injuries caused by gun battles, but also malnutrition, untreated infections, and diseases spread by poor sanitation. Though overwhelmed, they persisted, often sleeping on floors and rationing their own meals to ensure patients received the little available food. The economic decline was devastating. Markets that had operated for decades were deserted or burned down. The once bustling import docks functioned at a fraction of their capacity. With fewer goods entering the country, prices soared beyond imagination. A simple loaf of bread became a luxury for thousands of families. The gourd, Haiti's currency, weakened rapidly, making imports even more expensive and pushing more citizens into poverty. In the countryside, farmers struggled to transport their harvests to the city, knowing that the roads were controlled by armed groups who might seize the food or demand payment. Many crops rotted in fields as farmers calculated that the journey to market was not worth the risk of death or kidnapping. Yet amidst the turmoil, a quiet but powerful movement began to build across Haitian society. A movement of resistance not through weapons, but through unity. Community elders organized nighttime meetings where neighbors gathered to discuss safety strategies, share news, and plan how to protect vulnerable families. Religious leaders of all denominations, Catholic priests, Protestant pastors, and Vodou practitioners, held prayer gatherings that doubled as therapy sessions for traumatized communities. In these circles, people cried, told their stories, and reminded one another that Haiti had endured hardship before and could endure again. In the diaspora, Haitians living abroad organized fundraisers, humanitarian shipments, and awareness campaigns. Videos circulated on social media calling for support, demanding international attention, and urging foreign governments to respond with urgency and respect. Haitian artists, musicians, and writers used their platforms to document the suffering but also to highlight the bravery of ordinary people. Their work became a global window into the resilience that many mainstream news reports overlooked. Meanwhile, talks of an international security deployment intensified. Negotiations took place in New York, Washington, Nairobi, and across the Caribbean. Countries debated troop numbers, resources, timelines, and mandates, whether the mission would be a peacekeeping effort, a specialized anti-gang operation, or a hybrid force combining police and military expertise. But even as these discussions progressed, Haiti remained on edge. Every delay meant more violence, more displacement, more fear. Some Haitians welcomed the idea of external help. Others, shaped by the painful history of past interventions, questioned whether foreign forces would respect Haiti's sovereignty or repeat old mistakes. Inside Haiti, rumors spread quickly, rumors of imminent deployment, of political negotiations, of new alliances between local leaders and gangs. These rumors sometimes caused panic, sometimes hope, but always uncertainty. People started preparing for anything. Some stocked limited food supplies, others looked for escape routes, while many simply prayed for a turning point. It was a moment when the entire nation felt suspended between collapse and rescue, between darkness and the faint promise of restoration. The country had endured unimaginable hardship, but its people continued to fight for dignity, for survival, and for a future not defined by fear. What came next would determine whether Haiti could rise from the chaos or sink deeper into crisis. As Haiti moved into the next phase of its struggle, Section 9 captures the moment when the pressure reached its peak, when the violence, the political vacuum, and the humanitarian crisis all collided, creating a turning point that felt both terrifying and unavoidable. This was the stage where the entire country seemed to hold its breath, unsure whether the future would bring a long-awaited shift toward stability or a deeper plunge into chaos. It was the moment when every conversation, every movement, every day felt heavier than the one before. In Port-au-Prince, entire neighborhoods had been emptied as families fled, seeking any place that felt safer than the streets ruled by gunfire. The displacement crisis became one of the largest the country had ever witnessed. Schools, sports fields, unfinished buildings, and even sidewalks became temporary homes. Mothers laid pieces of cardboard on the ground for their children to sleep on, while fathers stood guard through the night, holding sticks, machetes, or anything they could use to defend their families if danger approached. Despite the hardships, people tried to create a sense of normal life, cooking small meals, washing clothes in buckets, and telling children stories to distract them from the sound of distant gunshots. Inside the city's hospitals, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Doctors worked without rest, moving from one operating room to another, treating gunshot wounds, burns, infections, and trauma. Medical supplies dwindled. Bandages were washed and reused, painkillers ran out, and doctors performed surgeries using outdated tools under dim light. Some patients died simply because there were no antibiotics, while others survived through sheer willpower and the dedication of the overwhelmed medical staff. The doctors themselves were not immune to danger. Several had been kidnapped in the preceding months, forcing many hospitals to shut down after dark or operate in near secrecy. As conditions worsened, the political landscape grew even more unstable. Haiti's transitional leaders tried to present plans for restoring order, but these efforts were often met with skepticism from the public and outright rejection from powerful armed coalitions. Every political announcement was accompanied by heated debates on radio stations, in markets, in refugee camps, and among diaspora communities abroad. Some believed new leadership could steer Haiti toward peace. Others argued that without powerful international support, no political figure could unite the nation. This division created an atmosphere of tension, where hope and distrust lived side by side. It was during this time that gang coalitions began pushing harder, consolidating their influence and attempting to reshape the balance of power in the capital. Armed groups conducted operations that were more coordinated than ever before, targeting strategic points such as police stations, transportation hubs, and fuel depots. They knew that controlling Haiti's supply chains meant controlling the country's lifeline. At night, the sky glowed orange from burning buildings, and the air carried the heavy scent of smoke mixed with fear. The streets were littered with barricades made from tires, metal sheets, and broken vehicles, some placed by gangs, others by citizens trying desperately to protect their neighborhoods. Yet even as violence surged, unknown heroes emerged. Youth groups formed night patrols, guiding vulnerable families through safe routes. Teachers who had lost their own homes continued giving lessons under trees or inside shelters, using chalk and scraps of cardboard as makeshift blackboards. Local radio hosts risked their lives to provide reliable information, warning listeners about dangerous areas and broadcasting messages of solidarity. In churches, priests and pastors organized food drives with whatever little they could find, turning places of worship into stations of hope where people cried, prayed, and found the strength to continue. Outside Haiti, pressure mounted on the international community. Images of burning neighborhoods, starving children, and overwhelmed hospitals triggered worldwide concern. Caribbean leaders held emergency meetings, calling for swift, coordinated action. The United Nations debated timelines, mandates, and funding, though bureaucratic processes slowed decisions. Meanwhile, activists in the diaspora demanded that foreign governments respond not with speeches, but with meaningful support. Haiti's allies understood that time was running out, but every decision carried enormous risk. As discussions intensified, whispers spread across Haiti that a major international mission was finally close to deployment. Some people welcomed the idea, believing it might be the only chance to break the cycle of violence. Others worried that foreign intervention would bring new complications or repeat the painful chapters of previous missions. But as the debate continued, facts on the ground did not wait. Families still fled, gangs still advanced, children still went to sleep hungry and afraid. Then came the incident that many Haitians later described as the moment the world could no longer look away. A coordinated series of attacks erupted across multiple zones in Port-au-Prince. Major highways were blocked, police forces were overwhelmed, and parts of the city fell into hours-long battles that sent shockwaves across the nation. Videos circulated rapidly, showing residents fleeing on foot, carrying small children, tightly holding bags filled with their most valuable belongings. The air thundered with explosions, and the government declared a state of extreme emergency. Haiti, by this point, felt dangerously close to collapsing entirely. Yet even in this darkest hour, Haitians refused to surrender. Community leaders negotiated brief ceasefires to allow trapped residents to escape. Volunteers drove injured victims to hospitals, navigating streets filled with smoke and chaos. And within the displaced camps, families held on to each other, telling themselves that they had survived too much already to believe the country would ever completely fall. The tension in the air was unmistakable. Something had to give, and the entire nation waited for the moment that would decide its direction. As Haiti approached one of the most decisive chapters in its modern history, Section 10 captures the moment when everything — fear, resilience, political tension, foreign intervention debates, and human endurance — finally converged into a turning point. It was a period shaped by anticipation, uncertainty, and an emotional exhaustion so deep that even the strongest voices in the country began to tremble. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming pressure, Haiti also witnessed the first signs of a slow, painful, but undeniable shift. In the aftermath of the massive coordinated attacks that had shaken Port-au-Prince, the country found itself standing at the very edge of total collapse. Entire regions had exhausted their food supplies. Neighborhoods once filled with laughter, markets, and music now echoed with the distant rumble of gunfire. Anxiety became a constant companion for families who lived day to day with no guarantee of safety. Every pathway became a gamble, every journey a silent risk, and every night an unknowable threat. Mothers wrapped their children tightly at bedtime, whispering prayers over their small heads, hoping dawn would find them alive and unbroken. But as the tensions reached their peak, Haiti also entered a moment of unexpected clarity, a collective realization that the country could not continue on this path. Even the armed groups, sensing the tightening pressure around them, began to shift their strategies. Some factions attempted to negotiate fragile truces, either for tactical advantage or because the loss of profit from disrupted supply chains had hurt them as well. Others doubled down, launching aggressive offensives to maintain control of strategic areas before any external mission could arrive. The capital transformed into a map of shifting lines, no one fully in control, no one completely defeated. At the heart of it all, the people of Haiti continued to resist in ways the outside world rarely saw. Market women reopened their stalls in the middle of rubble-strewn streets, calling out prices with exhausted voices. Tailors brought their needles and thread to makeshift camps, mending torn clothes for families who had fled with only what they wore. Fishermen risked their lives along the coast, navigating rough waters to bring in whatever catch they could so that children in shelters might eat at least one proper meal. These small acts of defiance against despair became the backbone of Haiti's survival. Meanwhile, the international community, finally moved by the scale of suffering, accelerated its discussions. Behind closed doors, diplomatic phone lines buzzed with urgency. Countries that had hesitated earlier now realized that waiting any longer meant allowing Haiti to slip into a crisis that could destabilize the entire region. Commitments were made, some public, others private, to send specialized support teams focused on logistics, humanitarian aid, and security training. International medical groups prepared shipments of critical supplies while engineering teams drafted plans to repair damaged infrastructure once conditions allowed. Inside Haiti, rumors of an international deployment gained strength. In the camps, people spoke quietly but intently, asking whether the help would truly arrive this time or whether it was another promise destined to fade. Some expressed cautious optimism, Others feared the unintended consequences of foreign involvement. But despite the uncertainty, one truth had become impossible to ignore. The country could no longer carry the burden alone. As anticipation intensified, Haiti's transitional leaders made a rare, unified announcement, one that called for national cooperation, community resilience, and international assistance. The message, broadcast on radios across the country, struck a chord not because it came from officials, but because it echoed what ordinary Haitians had long been feeling, that the road ahead would be long, painful, and complicated, but it was still a road worth walking together. And then, slowly, signs of renewal began to appear. Humanitarian convoys, escorted through negotiated safe corridors, reached neighborhoods that had been isolated for months. Volunteers distributed food, water, and medical kits. Some displaced families managed to return to their homes, even if those homes were little more than damaged walls and broken windows. In a symbolic gesture that touched the entire nation, a group of community leaders from rival neighborhoods came together to rebuild a destroyed school. Brick by brick, day by day, turning it into a symbol of hope. At the same time, gang influence, though still powerful, began to face its first serious crack. The exhaustion of prolonged battles, the pressure from local communities, and the growing presence of coordinated humanitarian efforts weakened their hold. Some leaders defected, seeking safety or negotiation. Others saw their recruitment dry up as young men, tired of endless fighting, chose to join community defense groups or flee to safer regions. For the first time in a long time, the balance of power began to shift. Not dramatically, but perceptibly, like the first breeze that hints at the coming of a storm's end. By the closing days of this period, Haiti's future remained uncertain, but something had undeniably changed. The country was still wounded, scarred, and fragile, but it was no longer collapsing. The resilience of its people, the pressure from its allies, and the long-awaited coordination of humanitarian forces had started to carve out a narrow path toward recovery. The struggle was far from over, and the challenges ahead remained enormous. But Haiti, a nation forged in resilience and resistance, had refused to disappear into the darkness. And that refusal became the first step toward a future that, for the first time in years, felt possible. Today, Haiti remains a nation at the crossroads of crisis and resilience, a place where the echoes of past conflicts collide with the pressing realities of the present. While large-scale battles between armed groups may no longer dominate international headlines as they once did, the country continues to face enormous challenges that shape daily life for millions of Haitians and test the limits of human endurance. From Port-au-Prince to remote towns and rural areas, the effects of years of instability remain painfully visible, yet so does the determination of the Haitian people to survive and rebuild. In the capital, security concerns remain high. Armed gangs still control key neighborhoods and major transportation routes, creating zones of influence that civilians must navigate with extreme caution. Kidnappings, theft, and extortion continue to be major threats, forcing residents to adjust their lives around unpredictability. Schools, while open in many areas, often operate under irregular schedules or close temporarily during spikes in violence. Hospitals struggle to meet the needs of the population, particularly in underserved neighborhoods, with shortages of medical supplies and staff shortages putting immense pressure on healthcare providers. Economic hardship, too, defines daily life. The cost of living has skyrocketed, fueled by inflation, currency instability, and disrupted supply chains. Many Haitians survive on informal work, selling goods on the street, offering services in local neighborhoods, or engaging in subsistence farming. Unemployment, particularly among young people, remains painfully high, and for some, joining armed groups has become a reluctant but compelling way to survive. Despite this, small-scale entrepreneurship, community markets, and cooperative initiatives have emerged, demonstrating the ingenuity and persistence of the people. Meanwhile, political instability continues to shape the nation's trajectory. Haiti has experienced repeated changes in leadership, delayed elections, and ongoing struggles to form a stable government capable of enforcing law and order nationwide. Corruption, weak institutions, and internal divisions have hindered recovery efforts, leaving the country dependent on international support for critical infrastructure, humanitarian aid, and security assistance. Diplomatic interventions, while helpful in some areas, have been inconsistent, leaving many Haitians skeptical of promises made from abroad. Natural disasters have compounded these challenges. Hurricanes, floods, and the lingering effects of earthquakes have further strained resources and displaced tens of thousands of families. Infrastructure, roads, bridges, and housing remains vulnerable, often repaired only to be damaged again. Humanitarian organizations, in collaboration with local groups, continue to provide emergency relief, but the scale of the need remains staggering. Access to clean water, electricity, and basic healthcare is still a daily struggle for a significant portion of the population. Yet amid these hardships, resilience shines through. Communities have organized neighborhood watch groups, local cooperatives, and grassroots initiatives to provide food, education, and safety. Families rely on networks of neighbors, friends, and extended relatives to support one another. Churches, schools, and cultural organizations offer not only spiritual guidance but practical resources, creating spaces of stability and hope in a country often defined by chaos. Young people, in particular, have become agents of change, using social media, arts, and activism to raise awareness, advocate for justice, and build alternative opportunities for themselves and their communities. Culturally, Haiti continues to express its identity with vibrancy and pride. Music, art, literature, and storytelling remain vital lifelines, providing both a form of resistance and a way to preserve national heritage. Despite ongoing crises, Haitians celebrate their history, maintain traditions, and transmit values of solidarity, courage, and resilience to the next generation. The current state of Haiti is a paradox of hardship and hope. Violence, poverty, political instability, and natural disasters continue to test the nation every day. But even as these challenges persist, the country is held together by the courage of its people, the strength of its communities, and the unshakable belief that survival is possible, even in the most difficult conditions. Haiti today is not a nation that has surrendered to crisis. It is a nation that continues to endure, fight, and resist, reminding the world that resilience can exist even in the darkest times. Haiti's story is one of courage, struggle, and resilience. A nation that has endured decades of conflict, violence, and hardship, yet continues to rise despite overwhelming odds. From the battles that shaped its past to the challenges it faces today, the people of Haiti remind us that hope can survive even in the darkest times. If this story moved you, hit the like button, share it to raise awareness, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories from around the world. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an update. We want to hear from you. Comment below with your thoughts, reflections, or stories about Haiti. Your voice matters, and your perspective can help bring this conversation to life. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in chaos and conflict, the human spirit endures.